Ever had an underqualified CEO's son, riding his family name, look you dead in the eye and say, "My last name outranks your resume"? I have. He fired me in a glass conference room. Thought he was cleaning up the team. He just didn't know one small thing: the system he's about to sell to their biggest client. I quietly patented it myself. He thought he fired an employee. He actually just signed his own career's death warrant. My name is Natalie Chapman. I'm 34 years old, and until about 10 minutes ago, I was the lead data compliance systems architect at Velastra Data Forge. Now, I'm just a woman sitting in a glass box on the 21st floor, watching my career get publicly executed by a man-child in an expensive suit. The air in the Innovation Hub is stale with the smell of burnt coffee and fear. We're surrounded by glass walls that look out over the Chicago River, supposed to symbolize transparency. They don't. They're just panes of glass that make every corporate assassination a spectator sport. At the head of the heavy oak table stands Mason Hale. He's the CEO's son, barely a year out from his last failed startup, something about luxury NFTs for pets. After a brief, finding himself sabbatical, he was gifted the title of Interim Head of Innovation. His face is a blotchy, unpleasant red, the kind that comes from unearned confidence and too much power. He's yelling, actually yelling, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "I don't want to hear another word from you. Natalie, my dad trusts me. You're done here." He slams his hand on the table, rattling the aluminum water bottles. His words hang in the air, sharp and final. I look around the table. There are 12 people here. 12 colleagues I've worked with, eaten lunch with, shared late-night code sprints with. Sarah from marketing is staring intently at her MacBook Pro, her typing unnaturally fast. Ben from sales is studying the ceiling tiles as if they hold the secrets of the universe. And then there's Kevin, in the corner, trying to be subtle. He's not. His phone is angled up from under the table, the small red light of its camera winking at me. He's recording this. No one speaks. No one moves. No one from HR is present. This isn't a meeting. It's a coliseum. And Mason just gave the thumbs down. He's pacing now, radiating a smug, frantic energy. He pulls a folded piece of paper from his blazer pocket. A script. Someone, probably his father's legal team, wrote this for him, effective immediately. He reads, his eyes scanning the page. Your employment is terminated. Your continued obsession with paperwork and your refusal to embrace our agile workflow have been identified as major blockers to progress. My obsession with paperwork is federal compliance law. The agile workflow he's talking about is his habit of skipping security protocols because they're boring. I keep my expression perfectly neutral. I don't cry. I don't raise my voice. I don't give him the satisfaction of a reaction. I just watch him. He's a terrible actor, reading his lines with the forced gravitas of a high school principal announcing a snow day. We need to move fast, he continues, finally looking up from the script and trying to sound visionary. And that's why I'm excited to announce that Tory Blake will be taking over the Orion project, effective immediately. He gestures to the woman sitting 2 seats down from me. Tory Blake, his college friend, the one with a resume thinner than this morning's coffee and a bright, predatory smile. She's been at Velastra for 6 weeks, listed as a strategic consultant, which mostly seemed to involve long lunches with Mason. Tory will be leading the final push for the Orion compliance engine. She gets the big picture. The Orion compliance engine. My engine. The system I designed from the ground up over the last 18 months to navigate the complex web of financial regulations for our biggest client, Orion Federal Trust. A project that would save them and make us hundreds of millions. Mason isn't done. He leans forward, placing his palms on the table, trying to look like his father. And let's be clear. So the whole team understands, he says, his voice loud enough to carry through the glass. Any IP built here, any code, any methodology, it all belongs to Velastra. It belongs to this company. He looks directly at me when he says it. It's a threat, a final nail. He's not just firing me, he's trying to brand me a non-entity, to erase my authorship, to make sure everyone in this room knows that whatever I created now belongs to the Hale family. I let the silence sit for a 5 count. Then, slowly, I close my leather-bound notebook. I don't look at him. I look at the people around the table, one by one. I see the flicker of pity in Sarah's eyes before she looks away. I see the undisguised, hungry smirk on Tori's face. And I see Luis, a senior developer I've mentored for 3 years, the one I fought to get a promotion for, the one who calls me his work mom. He's staring at his knuckles, his jaw tight, his shoulders hunched. He won't look at me. He's afraid. The fear in this room is so thick I can taste it. It's the smell of weak-willed ambition and self-preservation. I stand up. The chair legs make a soft scraping sound on the polished concrete floor. My badge. I say. My voice is steady, calm. Mason blinks, momentarily thrown off his script. He fumbles for a moment before nodding curtly. I reach up, unclip the blue Velastra badge from my belt loop, and place it on the table. It lands with a quiet, plastic click. I pick up my notebook and my laptop. I don't say good luck. I don't say, you'll regret this. I don't say anything. I just turn and walk toward the door. The walk from the conference room to my desk is the longest walk of my life. It's 50 yards of open-plan office, and I can feel every single eye on my back. The sound of typing has stopped. The only noise is the hum of the HVAC system and the click of my own heels. My desk is in the corner, by the window. As I get closer, I see Tori Blake is already there. Not at her own desk, but at mine. She's logged into a temporary profile on my machine, which is already set up on the docking station. She's so focused on the screen she doesn't even see me approach. I stop. On her monitor, displayed in crisp, high definition, is a PowerPoint slide. The header reads, Orion Compliance Engine, Final Pitch V3. And there, in the center of the slide, is a logic diagram. It's a simplified, slightly cleaner version of the architecture. The nodes are colored differently. The labels are in the corporate font, but it's mine. It's the exact model I sketched out in my private Moleskine notebook 6 months ago. The one I used as the foundation for the entire system. A model I never shared in any company-wide meeting. She looks up, startled. A flicker of guilt flashing across her face before she replaces it with a cool, dismissive stare. "Can I help you?" she asks, as if I'm a stranger. I don't answer her. I turn my gaze past her, toward the cluster of monitors at the innovation pod, where Mason is now holding court, already laughing about something with the sales team. His monitor is angled away, but a large shared display screen above him is still active, mirroring his desktop. He's got the company's shared drive open, and pinned to the top of his quick access list, right below CEO reports and golf trip photos, is a folder. The folder is named N. Chapman Private Sandbox. A chill, hard and sharp, goes right down my spine. That's my private repository, my development sandbox. It's where I keep my drafts, my experimental code, my notes, the things that aren't ready for prime time. It's supposed to be accessible only by me and the system admin. He's been in there. They've been in there. This wasn't an impulsive firing. This wasn't about blocking progress. This was a planned extraction. They waited until the engine was built, until the core logic was complete, and then they came for it. They're not just stealing the car, they're stealing the blueprints, and they just shot the architect. I look back at Tori, who is now looking at Mason with a triumphant, adoring expression. I look at my badge, sitting alone on the conference room table. They think they've won. They think they've taken everything. I turn away from the desk. I don't get my coat. I don't get the box for my personal items. I just walk toward the elevators, the chill in my spine solidifying into something else, something cold, heavy, and clear. It's not anger. It's not sadness. It's resolve. They didn't just fire me. They dug a grave for my work, and they're about to have a party on top of it. They have no idea what they just started. The elevator ride down from the 21st floor was silent. I didn't have a box of personal items. Security didn't escort me out. Mason was so high on his own power trip, so eager to perform for his audience. He'd forgotten the actual HR-mandated eviction process. I just walked out, past the reception desk, and through the gleaming chrome turnstiles that, hours ago, I needed a badge to open. I live in the Riverside district, in a small one-bedroom that costs too much but gives me a view of the water. The train ride was a blur of gray concrete and dull afternoon light. I didn't listen to a podcast. I didn't read. I just stared at my own reflection in the window, my face pale and impassive. I let myself into my apartment, the silence a welcome contrast to the forced hum of the Valastra office. I was still wearing my gray wool blazer, the armor I'd put on this morning for a completely different kind of battle. I dropped my leather satchel on the kitchen counter. My keys clattered loudly in the quiet. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked through the living room to my small desk, the one crammed into an alcove by the window. On it sat my personal laptop. It's an old, heavy machine, 7 years old, with a keyboard worn smooth. This is the machine that got me through my master's. This is the machine that has seen 1,000 all-nighters. The machine that holds my real work. The projects that have nothing to do with Valastra Data Forge. I sat down, the chair creaking under me. I booted it up. The familiar chime sounded almost too cheerful. While it loaded, I stared out the window at the river, and I let myself remember. 18 months. That's when the seed was planted. I was in Gregory Hale's office, the CEO's office, on the 35th floor. It was after I had single-handedly salvaged the Alistair account, pulling a data integrity miracle over one 72-hour weekend. I had put in for the vacant director of architecture role. It was a logical step. I was, by every metric, the most qualified person for the job. Gregory Hale, Mason's father, smiled at me over his antique mahogany desk. He had a way of smiling that didn't involve his eyes. "Natalie," he'd said, steepling his fingers, "your technical skills are, well, they're frankly astonishing. The best we have?" He paused, letting me absorb the empty praise. "But this is a leadership role. It requires a certain presence, a vision. The board and I, we just feel you're not quite leadership material. Not leadership material. It was code. The same corporate speak they'd used on every other woman in that department who got too good at her job. It meant I was a workhorse, not a show pony. It meant I didn't golf with him. It meant I called out flawed logic in meetings instead of nodding and smiling. I thanked him for his time. I walked out of his office, and that night, I went home, sat at this very desk, and opened a new browser tab. I typed in United States Patent and Trademark Office. Gregory was right about one thing. My technical skills were astonishing, and I knew, with absolute, burning certainty, that the compliance model I was sketching out in my private notebooks was more than just a feature. It was a new paradigm. It was brilliant, and I knew, even then, that Valastra would never see its value until they could steal it. So I started the process, quietly, alone. I spent nights and weekends learning the intricacies of patent law. I read USPTO manuals until my eyes burned. I took a quarter of my savings and hired a small, hungry IP lawyer from a firm on the other side of town, someone who had no connection to the big corporate firms Valastra kept on retainer. I wrote the technical specifications myself, every single line. I drew the logic diagrams by hand on graph paper, then scanned them one by one. I described the adaptive multi-layer compliance engine, a system that could intelligently adjust data scrubbing protocols based on cascading risk profiles, all in real time. I defined its scope, its inputs, its unique methodology, and when I filed the provisional application, and later the full utility patent, I did it all under one name, Natalie Elise Chapman, my home address, my personal email, not a single mention of Valastra. On my desktop, my old laptop finally settled. I opened my personal cloud drive. I clicked on a folder labeled USPTO/NC, and there it was. The email I'd been waiting for. It had arrived 7 weeks ago, while I was arguing with Mason in a budget meeting about server costs. Congratulations. The United States Patent and Trademark Office has officially granted patent number I read the number aloud to the empty room. It felt solid, real. 7 weeks. They'd fired me 7 weeks after my ownership of the company's next big thing was codified into federal law. Next, I opened another file. Employment Agreement, Natalie C., PDF. My original contract with Velastra. I knew its terms by heart. I'd read them until I was cross-eyed before I ever started the patent process. I scrolled down to Section 4 Intellectual Property. As I'd confirmed 18 months ago, the clause was standard. It said any IP, conceived or developed, within the scope of my employment, belonged to Velastra, but it did not contain the officer clause, the one they gave to VPs and C-suite executives, the one that assigned all inventions, regardless of scope, to the company. I was not an officer. I was not leadership material. Remember, and my model, the core concept, was conceived in this very chair, in this apartment, months before Velastra even pitched the Orion account. I had the metadata to prove it. They didn't own my notebook. They didn't own my brain. And they didn't own my patent. The chill I'd felt in the office was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp focus. I opened a secure, encrypted file sync log I'd set up long ago. It kept a passive, time-stamped record of access to my private company repositories. It was the kind of paranoid habit that Mason hated. There it was. User M, Hale, Access N, Chapman Private Sandbox. Time. Last Saturday, 2:03 a.m., IP address 72.144.3.1. I cross-referenced the IP. It was registered to the executive floor secure network in the Velastra building, the CEO's office. He'd been in my sandbox 4 times. 4 separate access logs over the last weekend. He hadn't just seen my work. He'd been digging through it, downloading it, passing it to Tori for her final pitch V3. Finally, I opened my personal export of my Slack history. I scrolled back 3 weeks. A direct message from me to Mason Hale. Mason, I'm flagging a risk on the Orion build. The logic you're pushing to demo is unstable. It's based on my experimental branch and hasn't been through full-stack compliance testing. We could be promising a functionality that creates massive legal exposure. I scrolled down. His reply, timestamped 5 minutes later. You worry too much. That's why you're stuck in the back end. Just make it work. I need something to show Dad. I stared at the screen. The pieces were all there. The theft, the motive, the proof of my warnings, the proof of his dismissal. My hand was on the mouse, but I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the urge to throw my laptop or scream. The humiliation from the glass room had burned away, leaving something hard and pure. This wasn't a personal attack anymore. It was a business transaction, and Mason Hale had just made a very, very bad investment. I created a new folder on my desktop. I named it Levers. Inside, I created 3 subfolders: Patent, Nepotism, Witnesses. I began to drag and drop the files, one by one. The granted patent, the employment agreement, the access logs, the Slack exports. I sat back, the dim light of the setting sun casting long shadows in the room. I looked at the email from the USPTO one more time, zooming in on the line near the top. Inventor Natalie E. Chapman, I said it quietly, to the dust motes dancing in the light. You didn't fire an employee today, Mason. You fired the owner. My Levers folder wasn't just about the patent. The patent was the weapon. But the nepotism was the rot. It was the delivery system for the poison. The reason Mason Hale felt untouchable enough to pull off such a blatant heist in the first place. I needed to map that rot. So, I started digging, not into code, but into people. For the next 48 hours, I barely slept. I lived on black coffee and the cold satisfaction of clicking links. My target, the entire Hale family ecosystem, which had been slowly metastasizing inside Velastra for the past 5 years. LinkedIn was my first stop. It's the public resume of everyone's private ambitions and inflated titles. I opened a new Excel spreadsheet. My nepotism map, column A name, column B title, Column C, relation to Hale family. Column D, qualifications or lack thereof. It didn't take long to populate. First, there was Mason, interim head of innovation, then his cousin, Chad, who was director of strategic partnerships, despite having a 3-year gap on his profile listed as travel and self-discovery after getting a communications degree. Then there was Mason's fraternity brother from Dartmouth, Kyle, now senior analyst, risk management, whose entire prior experience was managing a string of failed smoothie shops, and of course, Tori Blake, strategic consultant, whose primary qualifications seemed to be her long-standing friendship with Mason. By the time I was done, the spreadsheet had 22 names, 22 people in key roles: strategy, risk, finance, even HR, all linked back to Gregory or Mason Hale. They weren't just colleagues. They were a private army embedded in the corporate structure, all owing their paychecks to family loyalty, not merit. Their resumes were paper-thin, full of lateral moves and vague consulting gigs. Yet they held senior titles that people like me, people, not leadership material, were told we had to work a decade to earn. I saved the file in the nepotism folder. Then, I went through my email archives. I searched for a specific phrase not helpful to morale. I found it. An email from an HR business partner 2 years ago. After I'd submitted a project post-mortem, I had factually detailed how a server crash was caused by a last-minute, unvetted code push ordered by a strategic manager, Chad, the cousin. The HR rep had called me, her voice syrupy and false. "Hi, Natalie. We just reviewed your report. It's very detailed." "It's accurate," I'd said. "Yes, well," she'd replied, "this part where you name specific managers. We find it's just not helpful to morale to point fingers. Could you maybe rephrase it to focus on systemic process?" I had refused, and it had cost me. I got a needs improvement on collaboration in my next review, but I kept the email exchange. I saved the PDF of that exchange right next to the nepotism map. My phone buzzed on the desk. A new message on Signal, the encrypted app. It was from a number I didn't recognize, but the preview was clear. "Natalie, it's Jordan, from the old dev team. I heard what Mason did." Jordan, a brilliant, quiet developer who had quit 6 months ago, claiming burnout. I messaged him back. "Hey Jordan, long time." The reply was instant. "He's a snake. I heard he canned you over the Orion project. Is it true?" "More or less," I typed. "I knew it. He's doing it again." A long pause. Then, "Remember that Alastair crash, the one Gregory Hale almost got fined for by the SEC? I remembered it well. It was the 72-hour weekend I'd worked to fix it, the one I'd used to ask for the promotion I was denied. Mason pushed my code to prod without a final review," Jordan typed, the messages coming fast now. He was trying to impress his dad with a fast feature 2 days before the quarterly review. It broke the entire audit trail for Alastair's high-volume trading accounts. I told him not to. I have the chat logs. When it all went to hell, he went to his dad and said I'd gone rogue. I was put on a performance improvement plan. He got a bonus for crisis management. I still have the logs. Nat, the real ones, not the ones HR archived. Let me know if you need them. My fingers flew. "Yes, send them." 5 minutes later, a zip file landed in my inbox. I dragged it into the witnesses folder. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was a pattern. I spent the next day connecting the dots. I cross-referenced the nepotism map with every major project timeline from the last 3 years. A clear, sickening picture emerged. Every time Mason, or Chad, or Kyle made a catastrophic error, one that should have ended a normal person's career, a compliance miracle was required. And who was the head of compliance architecture? Me, my team. We were the Hale family's cleanup crew. We were the ones pulling the all-nighters to rebuild corrupted data, to patch security holes they'd blown open, to rewrite logic so that the auditors wouldn't see the tire fire, and then, like clockwork, a week later, an all-hands email would go out from Gregory Hale, congratulating Mason on his innovative leadership in resolving a complex challenge. My team's work, my architecture, was being used as a shield to protect the family's incompetence and as a ladder for Mason's fraudulent climb. They didn't fire me despite my skills. They fired me because of them. I was the one person who knew exactly where all the bodies were buried. And with the Orion deal, the biggest in Valastra's history, they couldn't risk having me in the room. I wasn't blocking progress. I was blocking the theft. I had it all: the patent, the contract, the access logs, the nepotism map, the witness testimony from Jordan, the email threads showing a clear pattern of fraud, cover-ups, and retaliation. I had the complete, undeniable story of how Mason Hale and his father had systematically exploited and plundered their own company, culminating in the theft of my intellectual property to save a deal they were too incompetent to win honestly. I zipped the entire levers folder, encrypted it, and put it on a thumb drive. It was time to find a lawyer. I didn't go to a big corporate firm. I went to a small cafe on a side street, 3 blocks from the Valastra Tower. Close enough to smell the enemy, but far enough to be anonymous. The air smelled of burnt espresso and old wood. She was already there, in a back booth, nursing a black coffee, Lena Park. We'd been in the same advanced coding class in college, back before she'd shocked everyone by going to law school. She was smarter than all of us, and she was the only person I knew who found legal loopholes as fascinating as I found system architecture. We hadn't talked in years, but I knew she'd started her own small firm specializing in labor and IP law. She didn't have any ties to the Hale family. "Nat," she said, nodding, no hug, no pleasantries. Lena was all business. "You look like hell." "I feel like I'm about to give it," I said. Sliding into the booth, I didn't order anything. I just pulled the thumb drive from my pocket and slid it across the table. "I need you to look at this, all of it." For 20 minutes. Lena said nothing. She plugged the drive into a hardened, secure laptop she'd brought, her face illuminated by the screen in the dim cafe. I watched her read. I saw her eyebrows raise slightly when she opened the patent PDF. I saw her mouth tighten into a thin line as she scrolled through the nepotism map. I saw a small, dangerous smile play on her lips when she read Jordan's signal messages. When she was done, she closed the laptop. She took a slow sip of her cold coffee. "So," I said, my voice hoarse, "what's the play? Wrongful termination IP infringement." Lena laughed. It was a sharp, dry sound, like glass breaking. "Nat, if this was just wrongful termination, they'd bury us in HR paperwork and make you sign an NDA for a year's severance. If this was just IP infringement, they'd claim work for hire and bleed us dry in court for 5 years. She leaned forward, her eyes electric. "They didn't just steal your work, Nat. They weaponized their last name. They built a system of nepotism to facilitate it, and they retaliated against you when you became a threat to the scheme. That's not just IP infringement, that's retaliation and corporate fraud waiting to happen." "So we sue," I said, the word tasting like iron. "No," Lena shook her head, that dangerous smile returning. "We don't sue. Not yet. If you sue, you're just a disgruntled ex-employee. Valastra's PR team, which I see is run by Gregory's niece, will spin this as a performance issue. They'll claim you're bitter. They'll tie you up in court. And even if you win in 3 years, the Orion deal is done. Mason is a hero, and your patent is just a footnote." She tapped the thumb drive. "You don't want to be a grievance. Nat, you want to be a governance problem." I waited. "Valastra isn't the real target," Lena continued, her voice low. "They're just the vendor. The real target is the customer. Orion Federal Trust. They're a bank. They're about to license a core compliance engine. What do you think their regulators, their shareholders, and their own legal team would say if they found out that the entire system is built on stolen to patented IP? That the vendor who sold it to them fired the actual owner and installed the CEO's unqualified son to take credit. A slow, cold understanding dawned on me. This was so much better than a lawsuit. "You don't send a cease and desist," Lena said, her smile widening. "You let the client discover the problem. You let Orion Federal Trust ask Mason Hale, in front of his father and the board, a very simple question: do you actually own what you're selling us? She leaned back, her point made. That's how you make it hurt. You don't attack them in court. You let them walk, blindfolded, right into their biggest client, and you just hand the client the truth. My strategy, Lena's strategy, wasn't to kick down the front door. It was to light a small, precise fire in the basement and let them suffocate on their own smoke. It was a governance problem, and it required a scalpel, not a hammer. My first move wasn't an attack. It was a piece of bait. I spent an evening creating a 2-page technical summary. I took the core logic diagrams from my patent, the ones I'd seen on Tory Blake's screen, and laid them out in a clean, academic format. I described the methodology, the adaptive multi-layer compliance engine, using the exact technical language from my patent filing. I stripped away all Velastra branding, all project names. It was just the pure, naked architecture, and at the bottom of the first page, in a simple 8-point font, I included the full, granted United States patent number. I didn't mention Velastra, I didn't mention Orion. I just created a document that proved the concept was a distinct, legally protected invention. Lena, meanwhile, was a master of bureaucratic warfare. She didn't send this to Orion's general counsel. She didn't email their CEO. She found the link to their anonymous, the third-party ethics and compliance portal, the kind of place designed for reporting SEC violations or internal fraud. She helped me draft the report that went with my 2-page summary. It was a masterpiece of professional concern. To the Orion Federal Trust Risk Governance Committee, it began. We are submitting this anonymously as concerned industry observers. The methodology you are currently evaluating for the Orion Compliance Engine appears to be substantially derived from the attached patented work owned by an external inventor. We believe this methodology, and its core logic, is protected under USPTO patent number. It has come to our attention that this inventor, the architect of the system, was recently terminated under unusual circumstances by the vendor's CEO's son, who has since taken credit for the project. It was beautiful. Not an accusation, just a statement of fact. Phrased as a helpful regulatory warning, we sent it into the digital void. At the same time, I lit a smaller, smokier fire. I used a secured VPN, routed through 3 countries, and a fresh throwaway account on TechGraph, the anonymous forum where half the industry goes to vent and trade salary secrets. The post was simple. Title: Hypothetical, How Screwed Is My Friend? Body: Hypothetical question for the floor. How often do CEOs' kids get innovation roles, steal the core IP from the actual architect, and then fire them right before the big client pitch, asking for a friend who happens to have the patent on the entire system they're about to sell? Does my friend have any leverage, or is the nepotism too strong? It was vague enough to be legally safe, but specific enough to be radioactive to anyone in the Chicago tech finance scene. The replies started within minutes. Your friend needs a lawyer, like yesterday. This sounds like Velastra, am I right? It sounds like Velastra. Get lawyer and leak it to the client, anonymously. The whispers had begun, and when people are whispering, they start to listen, and when they're scared, they start to talk. The first message arrived 2 days later, a signal text from an unknown number. It was just a screenshot. No text, no explanation. It was a Slack channel at Velastra. Mason's name, all caps, in a channel named Orion Pitch War Room. Emergency pitch rehearsal, mandatory. Everyone in this room at 9 a.m. tomorrow. A reply from Tory Blake. Got it. What's the fire? Mason's reply. We need to lock down the narrative. Legal is getting antsy. From now on, all references to Natalie Chapman are to be removed from the materials. We're rebuilding the deck. If anyone asks, she was a contractor whose term ended. She was toxic to the culture and we're moving on. Toxic to the culture. The classic, final knife twist for anyone, especially a woman, who dares to be right when a man in power is wrong. An hour later, another message. This one was a DM on LinkedIn. From a former intern I'd mentored, a smart kid named Alex. He'd sent me a connection request from his new non-Velastra job. "Hey, Natalie, I don't know what's going on, but this is so messed up. I heard what they're saying and it's insane," I wrote back. "Be careful." "Alex," he replied instantly, "I'm already gone. I just wanted you to know. They made all of us on the Orion team sign a new NDA right after you left. Like, the day after. They said it was just standard procedure for trade secrets. But it was really weird. Everyone was panicking. By the way, I was cleaning up the old spec docs for the handoff to Tori. Your initials are still in the document properties of all the originals. They didn't even know how to scrub the metadata." I stared at the message. They were panicked. They were forcing NDAs on current employees after the fact. A move so transparently desperate it was almost funny. And they were too incompetent to even properly erase my digital fingerprints. I saved the Slack screenshot. I saved the intern's message. I saved the link to the panicked TechGraph thread, which now had over 200 replies. I dragged every single file into the Witnesses folder, which was growing heavier by the hour, the new NDAs, the time-stamped toxic comment, the metadata. It was a perfect, beautiful timeline of a cover-up in progress. The real explosion came 3 days later, not in my inbox, but in Lena's. It was a forwarded email. This was the real leak. An analyst inside Orion Federal Trust, someone who had clearly seen the anonymous report and the TechGraph thread, and who likely had their own career to protect, had forwarded an internal Velastra email chain to a burner account Lena monitored. My heart was hammering in my chest as I read it over Lena's shoulder in her small office. From Mark Sutter, Legal Counsel, Orion Federal Trust, to Gregory Hale, Mason Hale, Tori Blake, CC, Nadia King, Head of Risk Compliance, Orion Federal Trust, Subject Urgent, Authorship and IP Status, Orion Compliance Engine. Following up on our preliminary review, and in light of new information brought to our governance committee, we require a full authorship breakdown, a verified patent status, and a complete development timeline, including all key personnel and commit histories. For the adaptive multi-layer compliance engine methodology, please provide this documentation within 48 hours, prior to our final pitch meeting. We cannot proceed until our team has full clarity on the chain of title for this core IP. My breath hitched. "Nadia King," I whispered. "She's their head of compliance. She's tough. She's legendary." "Look," Lena said, pointing to the bottom of the screen. The chain included Mason's reply, sent just an hour later, dripping with unearned confidence and a complete lack of understanding of the gravity of the situation. From Mason Hale to Mark Sutter. "Hi, Mark. Happy to clarify. This is just a formality, I assume. Glad to see you're all doing your due diligence. The engine was developed fully in-house by our innovation team, and we're very proud of it. We have all the documentation. Don't worry. Looking forward to showing you the final product at the pitch. We're excited to finalize the partnership." He'd signed it with a breezy, "Best, Mason." I looked at Lena. "He just lied," I said, my voice flat. "He just lied. In writing, to the client's legal counsel." "No," Lena said, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across her face. "He just walked right into the trap. He thinks developed in-house is an answer. He has no idea that Mark Sutter isn't asking about the company. He's asking about the inventor." She was right. Mason still thought this was paperwork. He still thought his last name was a shield. He didn't realize he'd just been handed a shovel and, in his desperate attempt to look like he was in charge, he'd started digging his own grave. I went home and opened my levers folder. I opened the strategy document inside. I added a new note. "Do not attack directly. Let the client ask the questions Mason Hale cannot answer. Let them ask the questions that only I and my patent can." The stage was set. The bait was taken. Now, I just had to wait for the curtain to rise. The email arrived on a Thursday morning, exactly 1 week after my termination. It wasn't from a burner account or an anonymous source. It was from Nadia King, Head of Risk Compliance, Orion Federal Trust. And it came to my personal, private email address, the one listed on my patent. My heart didn't stop. It just started beating differently. A low, heavy, metronomic rhythm. "Hi, Natalie," it began, the professional cheeriness feeling like a mask. "I'm Nadia King from Orion. I've seen some of your white papers on compliance frameworks and industry forums over the years, and I've always been impressed with your clarity. A bit of a long shot, but we are holding a final vendor pitch for a new compliance system tomorrow. Would you, by any chance, be open to attending as an external technical observer for our team? Your expertise would be invaluable." I read it 3 times. Seen some of your work in industry forums. It was a perfect piece of corporate code. She was telling me, in the clearest way she possibly could, that she had connected the dots, the anonymous report, the 2-page summary, the tech graph post, the patent number. She hadn't just received the warning, she had investigated it, found me, and was now inviting me directly to the scene of the crime. Or rather, the scene of the attempted cover-up. Someone at Velastra hadn't licked their lips. They had full-on blabbed, or Nadia was just that good. Either way, the invitation was real. I called Lena immediately and read her the email. I heard her smile over the phone. Well, she said. Ms. King isn't just sending a warning shot. She's inviting the artillery to the parade. Write her back. Be professional. Be curious. Be available. I kept my reply simple. Thank you. Ms. King, I'm flattered you remember my work. I am available tomorrow. Could you provide a few more details on the scope of the observation? Her reply came back in less than 15 minutes. This time, the mask was off. Natalie, thank you for the quick response. To be perfectly transparent, we are in the final contract finalization phase with your former vendor, Velastra Data Forge. However, some significant questions about authorship and IP ownership on the core methodology have come up in our final due diligence. My job is to ensure we have clarity now, before we are standing in front of regulators, not after. Your presence as an independent expert would help us verify the technical claims being made. She had just, in polite legalese, confirmed everything. The bomb was set. An official calendar invitation followed. Orion Federal Trust Vendor Pitch Review. The location Orion headquarters, 45th floor. And attached was a formal letter of engagement for a 1-day consultation. The attendee name, N. Chapman, External Compliance Systems Consultant. A note at the bottom read, "A temporary badge will be printed and waiting for you at our main reception desk. We look forward to your insights." I wasn't an employee. I wasn't a victim. I was a consultant. I was an expert. They were paying me to be there. The irony was so thick, so delicious, I almost laughed. That night, my living room floor was ground zero. I didn't have a war room, just a worn-out rug and a pot of strong, bitter coffee. I spread out every single document from my levers folder, the printed certified copy of the USPTO patent grant, the full nepotism map, 22 names long, the printouts of Jordan's signal messages and the Alistair crash logs, the Slack exports, the screenshot of Mason's toxic to the culture rant, my employment agreement, the timeline of the panic NDAs. It was a mountain of evidence, enough to bury Velastra in a dozen different lawsuits. Lena came over. She wasn't drinking coffee. She was drinking water with lemon. Calm as always. She looked at the mosaic of paper I'd laid out. "This is an avalanche, Nat," she said. "It's beautiful, and it's 10 times more than you need for tomorrow." "What do you mean?" "You're not a prosecutor tomorrow," she said, kneeling on the rug. "You're an expert witness, and more than that, you're a landmine. You don't need to explode with all of this. You just need to be exactly what you are, the undeniable, unavoidable truth. We don't want to show them the whole story of the cover-up, not yet. We just want to prove, unequivocally, who owns the building." She started making a new, smaller pile. The patent, front page, with the seal and your name. The diagram slide from Tori's deck I saw. The Slack DM where you warn Mason about using the unstable branch. The official email terminating your employment, signed by Mason. The timeline. Just the dates. Patent granted. Mason accesses sandbox. Natalie fired. Orion pitch. She took these 5 pieces of paper, this sharp, minimalist story of theft and retaliation, and slid them into a simple, elegant, black file folder, not a floppy 3-ring binder, a thin, blade-like portfolio. She pulled a silver paint pen from her briefcase and, in her perfect, architectural handwriting, wrote one word on the cover. Ownership. This, she said, tapping the folder, is all you bring. You don't present it. You don't wave it around. You keep it in your bag. You sit in the back. You let Mason Hale, the interim head of innovation, do his entire song and dance. You let him lie. You let him preen. You let him sell your work as his own, in front of everyone. And then, I asked, my voice low. And then, Lena said, you wait for Nadia King or Mark Sutter to ask the question. The one question Mason hasn't prepared for, because he doesn't even know it is a question. Who exactly holds the patent? And when he fumbles, when he says proprietary or in-house, that's when Nadia will look at you, and that's when you can speak. The plan was perfect. It wasn't about screaming. It wasn't about a dramatic confrontation. It was about letting the truth land with the quiet, devastating weight of gravity. I held the folder. It felt heavy, not with paper, but with what it represented. You know, if you've ever wanted to see a clueless CEO's son, a kid who has failed upward his entire life, get hit with the simple, unanswerable question, who actually owns this in front of the single biggest client of his father's career? That is the exact moment you'd smash the like button for this video. That's the moment the payoff begins. I made Lena leave. I needed to be alone. I stood in my bedroom, the black ownership folder on my bed. I pulled my best suit from the closet. Not a power suit, not a statement suit, just a simple, perfectly tailored, medium gray wool blazer and matching pants. The kind of suit that says, I am competent, I am serious, and I am not here to be noticed until I want to be. I hung it on the back of my door. I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I looked tired, but for the first time in a week, my eyes were clear. The fear was gone. The humiliation from the glass room had been burned out, calcified into this single, cold point of focus. Tomorrow, Mason Hale was going to stand up in a room full of bankers, lawyers, and executives, and he was going to present my work. He was going to use my name, my reputation, my toxicity, as the reason for his new, bright future. He was going to try and erase me. But that's the beautiful thing about the United States Patent and Trademark Office. It's a government agency. It deals in facts, and on a piece of paper. In a federal database, it says, Inventor Natalie E. Chapman. I looked at my reflection and said the words out loud. Tomorrow, Mason Hale is going to discover that they cannot fire me from a document I already registered with the United States government. The lobby of the Orion Federal Trust Tower was a cathedral of glass and brushed steel. The carpets were so thick they absorbed all sound, creating a pressurized, wealthy silence. This was old money U.S. bank territory. Everything was designed to make you feel small, to remind you that they were the ones with the power. I walked to the main reception desk, a massive block of black marble. Natalie Chapman, I said to the uniformed receptionist, I'm here for the 9 a.m. Velastra pitch. I'm an external observer for Nadia King. The receptionist didn't blink. He typed my name and a small printer behind his desk word. He handed me the laminated badge. It was heavy, professional. It read, Observer, N. Chapman. There was no Velastra logo, no visitor designation, just my name and my new role, an observer. I clipped it to my gray blazer. The elevator to the 45th floor was silent and terrifyingly fast. When the doors opened, I was in another world of quiet corridors and million-dollar skyline views. I was directed to the main boardroom. It was exactly as you'd picture it. A single, massive, polished table that must have cost more than my apartment, surrounded by at least 30 chairs. One entire wall was glass, looking out over the city. At the front, a screen the size of my living room wall displayed the Velastra and Orion logos, joined by a polite plus sign. Mason and Tori were already at the front, standing by the screen, arranging their laptops. Mason was wearing what he clearly thought was his serious business suit, a navy blue pinstripe that was too tight in the shoulders. Tori was in a bright red dress, a tactical choice, designed to draw the eye. The Velastra sales team, about 5 of them, were arranged on one side of the table, smiling with the forced, brittle confidence of people who know their commissions depend on the next hour. The Orion team, Nadia King and Mark Sutter among them, sat opposite, looking calm, serious, and utterly unimpressed. I slipped in quietly. I took a seat in the back row, in one of the chairs against the wall, not at the main table. I was just an observer, after all. I took out my leather notebook, the one I'd brought from home, and a pen. Mason, in the middle of a loud, pre-pitch laugh with one of his sales guys, glanced over. He saw me. His eyes flickered over my gray blazer, my notebook, my observer badge. I was nobody. I was just part of the furniture, a consultant, a tech person in the back. He didn't recognize me. Why would he? In his world, I had ceased to exist the moment he fired me. He turned back to his team, checking his reflection in the dark glass of the monitor, smoothing his already too gelled hair. Nadia King, however, did see me. Her eyes met mine from across the room. She gave me a single, almost imperceptible, nod. It wasn't a welcome, it was a confirmation. The piece is in place, I nodded back, just as slightly. The meeting started. Mason kicked it off, his voice booming with a false confidence that rattled around the quiet, expensive room. Thank you all for this opportunity. We at Velastra are more than just a vendor. We are a trusted partner in the data revolution. I started taking notes, not on the pitch, but on his language. He used synergy 4 times in the first 5 minutes. He used innovation 9 times. He kept talking about AI-driven frameworks and next-generation agility. I silently counted the technical terms he mispronounced. We were up to 3 by the time he got to the second slide. He was a terrible public speaker, all bluster and buzzwords, gesturing wildly at slides that were nothing but stock photos of diverse, happy people looking at computer screens. He was performing, not communicating. After 10 minutes of this verbal, empty-calorie salad, he finally gestured to Tori. And now, for the core of our solution. Tori. Tori. Blake stepped up, her red dress a slash of color in the gray room. She clicked the remote. The slide changed. The header read, Orion Compliance Engine, Adaptive Logic Layers. And there it was, my diagram, my exact diagram. It was the one from my patent application. It wasn't simplified. It wasn't redrawn. They had literally screenshotted it, probably from my private sandbox repo, and pasted it into their pitch deck. They hadn't even bothered to fix the typo. In the bottom right node, the word authentication was misspelled with 2 N's, the same typo I'd made in my original hand-drawn sketch, the one I'd kept as a digital watermark. My heart was beating a hard, steady rhythm against my ribs. So, Mason said, stepping back in front of the screen, gesturing to my work as if he'd built it with his bare hands. This is the secret sauce. Basically, this is like a smart safety net. It cascades checks in real time. The logic layers. They adapt, so you're always ahead of the curve. He was reading from a script, not just a metaphorical one. I could see his eyes flicking to note cards in his hand. He was reading a description of my system, and he did not understand a single word of it. He was a child reading a physics textbook aloud, proclaiming himself a physicist. I tore my eyes away from Mason and looked at the Orion side of the table. Nadia King was not looking at Mason. She was staring, hard, at the diagram on the screen. Then, her eyes dropped to a stack of papers on the table in front of her. A stack of papers I knew very well. She slowly, deliberately, turned over the top page. which I could see was a printout of my patent summary. She stared at the paper. She stared at the screen. Then, her eyes lifted. They traveled across the entire length of the room, past the Velastra sales team, past the empty chairs, and locked directly onto mine. She raised one eyebrow, very slightly. "This it?" I gave her the single, slow nod I had been holding for a week. "That's it." She turned back to the front. Mason was just wrapping up his fumbled explanation. "And that's the kind of visionary, secure partnership Velastra brings to the table." He was smiling, proud of himself. A hand went up on the Orion side. It was quiet, polite. It was Mark Sutter, the legal counsel. "Thank you, Mason. That's very impressive," he said. His voice mild, almost casual. "Just one quick clarification on that last slide. The methodology. Is this methodology patented? The air in the room didn't just get tense. It evaporated. The HVAC system, which I hadn't noticed before, suddenly sounded like a jet engine." Mason's smile faltered. It was a small-scale collapse, a tectonic shift of arrogance and panic. He laughed. A short, sharp, "Ha! Patented," he said, as if the idea was absurd. "Well, it's proprietary. To Velastra. Of course, we, He looked at Tori, who was suddenly staring very, very intently at her laptop. "We are in the process of formal filings. Obviously, my team, my internal team, developed this from the ground up." He had done it. He had lied, in front of a room full of lawyers, to a client, with his entire team watching. Nadia King leaned forward. She didn't look at Mason. She turned her head, slowly, and looked directly at me, in the back of the room, a full 45-degree turn, making it obvious to everyone in the room. Then, she turned back to Mason. "Interesting," she said, her voice clear and cutting, "because the structure you just showed us, and even the diagram formatting, right down to the spelling, it looks very similar to a granted utility patent we just reviewed this week." She paused, letting the words land. "Under a different name." Mason's face went from blotchy red to a pale, waxy white. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out, and that was my cue. I didn't stand up. I didn't say a word. I simply reached down into my satchel, took out the thin black folder Lena and I had prepared, the one with the single word, ownership, written on it in silver, and I placed it, with a quiet, definitive thud, on the small observer's table beside my chair. The room was so quiet, I could hear the faint click of the folder's cover against the wooden table. All eyes, which had been on Mason, were now on me. Nadia King didn't take her eyes off me, but she spoke to the room. "Ms. Chapman," she said, her voice perfectly calm, perfectly modulated. "Would you mind joining us at the table for a moment?" That was it, the first time my name had been spoken. Chapman. I saw Mason's head snap toward me, his waxy, white face crumpled in on itself, his eyes widening in a way that was almost comical. He wasn't just looking at an observer anymore. He was seeing me, Natalie Chapman, the ghost at his feast. He looked like he'd been electrocuted. A sudden, violent jolt of recognition. I stood up, slowly. I didn't want to rush this. I picked up the black folder. The walk from the back wall to the main conference table was only about 20 feet, but it felt like a mile. In the suffocating silence, the sound of my own heels on the thick, sound-dampening carpet was the only noise. Shh, shh, shh. A soft, rhythmic, damning sound. I kept my eyes on Nadia King and Mark Sutter. I did not look at Mason. I did not look at Tori Blake, who I could feel staring at me, her face frozen in a rictus of confusion and rage. I passed the Velastra team. I saw their faces. The sales lead, who had been laughing with Mason 10 minutes ago, was now staring at his own laptop, his face buried in his hands as if in prayer. Two of the junior analysts were whispering frantically to each other, their eyes wide. "Who is she?" I reached the head of the table. I stood between Nadia and Mark, directly opposite Mason and Tori. I held the black ownership folder for 1 second, then placed it gently on the polished wood in front of Mark Sutter. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes. I nodded. Just once. He opened the folder. There, on top, was the cover page. The official, embossed seal of the United States Patent and Trademark Office, and the title, in clear, bold, government-issued type, Adaptive Multi-Layer Compliance Engine for Financial Risk Environments. And below that, the line that mattered. Inventor Natalie E. Chapman. A collective, sharp intake of breath. The air had been sucked out of the room. Mark Sutter took the page and held it up, his eyes flicking from the paper in his hand to the massive screen at the front of the room. He looked at the diagram on the patent. He looked at the diagram on the slide. He looked at the node descriptions. He looked at the data flow arrows. His eyes narrowed. I knew what he was looking for. He found it. The small typo in the bottom right node. Authentication. It was on the patent. It was on the slide. A perfect, identical match. A sloppy, arrogant, cut-and-paste job. The room was a vacuum. Mason finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, strangled squeak. A complete shattering of the baritone bravado from 20 minutes ago. There must be some mistake. That's not right. Natalie. Natalie worked for me. She worked under my direction. Anything she did. It's Valastra's. He was looking at Nadia, at Mark, at anyone but me. He was pleading. I spoke. My voice wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was just a fact. It was the first time I'd spoken in that room. Actually, Mason, I said, and his head snapped to me, his eyes full of pure animal panic. That's not correct. I kept my gaze level. By the time you rejoined Valastra after your sabbatical, this model was already in my personal notebook. It had already been filed as a provisional patent under my name, for my home address. It was not, at any point, scoped into the Orion Project deliverables until after my architecture was complete. I reached into the folder, which Mark was still holding open. I pulled out the next few pages. This, I said, placing an email on the table, is a direct message from me to you, dated 3 weeks ago, warning you not to use this experimental branch in a client demo because it was legally unvetted and unstable. I placed another paper down. This is the follow-up email to your father, Gregory Hale, flagging the same IP risk, which was ignored, and then, the last one, the termination letter. And this, I said, is my notice of termination, effective immediately, for blocking progress, signed by you, dated 7 weeks after my patent was formally granted by the United States government. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of an entire company's narrative collapsing. Mark Sutter looked up from the papers. He looked past Mason, directly at the Valastra sales team, who looked like they were about to be physically ill. Then he looked back at me. His lawyer face was gone. He was just a man who had found the answer to his question. So to be crystal clear, he said, his voice ringing out in the room, Valastra does not hold this patent. Ms. Chapman does. I didn't need to elaborate. I didn't need to add emotion. Correct, I said. They fired me 7 weeks after it was granted, and they never, at any point, attempted to negotiate a license. Nadia King, who had been watching this entire exchange like a hawk, made her move. She reached over and closed the black folder. The sound was soft, but it had the finality of a judge's gavel or a coffin lid closing. In that case, she said, looking at the entire terrified Valastra delegation, we need to pause this pitch. Immediately. We cannot, and will not, proceed with a vendor who is presenting a core compliance system they do not legally own. The regulatory exposure is unacceptable. She had just pulled the plug, the hundreds of millions of dollars plug. Mason's face was a wreck. The color had drained, then rushed back in an ugly, blotchy tide. He was breathing heavily, his hands clutching the edge of the table. He looked to his left, at Tori Blake. Tori, he whispered, a desperate plea. Tori Blake, for the first time, looked terrified. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at Nadia King. She was an ambitious woman, but she wasn't stupid. She knew when to cut bait. She said nothing. He looked behind him, at his sales team. Guys, they all looked away. They looked at their phones, at their notepads, at the floor. Not one of them would meet his eye. I heard one of them, the sales lead who had been so jovial, mutter a single, panicked sentence under his breath. Gregory is going to lose it. It was the first time I'd heard the CEO's name spoken with anything but reverence. Now, it was a sound of pure fear. My job here was done. I wasn't part of this conversation anymore. I was the expert, the observer, and I had observed. I turned away from the table. I walked the 20 feet back to my chair against the wall. Shh, shh, shh. I sat down. I picked up my notebook, but I didn't open it. There was nothing left to write. I just watched Mason Hale. He was still standing at the head of the table, but he had never looked smaller. He was completely, utterly alone, surrounded by his own team. He was a man drowning in a sea of expensive carpet, and not one person would throw him a line. I looked at his face. The arrogance was gone. The smugness was gone. The visionary innovator was gone. All that was left was a very small, very scared boy who had just been handed a bill he couldn't pay. This, I thought to myself, as I watched him finally, shakily, collapse into his chair. This is the face of a man meeting consequence for the very first time. The elevator ride down from the 45th floor was just as silent as the ride up, but the air was different. I was the same observer in a gray blazer, but the power in the building had shifted. The gravity had reversed. I was halfway across the marble lobby, heading for the revolving doors, when my phone vibrated in my pocket. It wasn't a call. It was a signal message, a number I didn't recognize. They locked down 3 of the main Slack channels. I stopped, just short of the door. "Who is this?" I typed. "The intern, Alex, from the compliance team, the one you helped with the SQL query. They just disabled file uploads for everyone below director, and they just pulled all of Mason's team into an urgent all hands. People are freaking out. So, that's subtle," I typed. "Be safe, Alex. Delete this." The reply, "Already did. Good luck, Natalie." The message vanished. I pushed through the revolving door and stepped out onto the windy Chicago street. The news of the pitch implosion was already spreading through Valastra's network before my foot even hit the pavement. They weren't just incompetent. They were porous, a sinking ship made of screen doors. I didn't take the train. I took a cab. On the ride, I pulled out my phone and opened LinkedIn. It was a compulsion. I just wanted to see. I didn't have to scroll far. A post from a senior project manager at a rival tech firm. Someone I knew was connected to a couple of the Valastra sales guys. It was perfectly, professionally vague. Just a thought for the day when you decide to sideline the architect. Don't be shocked when the building inspector calls. And they always call. Leadership accountability tech. The comments were already starting. "Oof, this sounds specific. Spill the tea. Heard some rumbles from a buddy at V. Sounds like a bad day over there." It was out, not just in the company, but in the industry. The whispers I had started with a single anonymous post had just become a roar. By the time I got back to my apartment, my phone was vibrating off the kitchen counter. Unknown number. I watched it buzz. It stopped. 2 seconds later. Unknown number. It stopped. A minute later. No caller ID. I called Lena. "They're calling," I said, watching the phone light up again. Non-stop. "Of course they are." Lena's voice was calm, almost cheerful. "They're not calling you, Natalie. They're calling the patent holder. They're trying to find out if you're a threat they can buy, or a problem they have to crush. Don't answer. Not a single one. Let them leave voicemails. We need every single panicked word on the record." So I let them. I turned the ringer off and just watched the screen. 16 missed calls in 1 hour. From Gregory Hale's executive assistant, from the head of HR, the one who'd told me my reports were not helpful to morale, from a partner at Valastra's corporate law firm, and most tellingly, From 3 different numbers, I traced back to members of the Velastra Board of Directors. I poured a glass of water, sat at my desk, and finally, I checked the voicemails. Most were just panicked hang-ups or a stiff, "Natalie, this is lawyer's name. Please call me back immediately." But then there was one I had been waiting for. The voice was older, shaky, stripped of its usual boardroom authority. Natalie Chapman. This is Neil Carlton, from the Velastra board." He cleared his throat. I could hear the expensive, hollow sound of his corner office. "Listen, it seems there's been a significant misunderstanding. We on the board, we were not aware that you individually held the patent for the Orion methodology. That was not made clear to us." A long, terrible pause. "Look, Gregory and Mason, we're handling that, but your work is very important. If that's the case, if you are the inventor, perhaps we can discuss a collaborative resolution. There's a path forward for all of us. Please, just call me back." I saved the voicemail. I exported the audio file. I put it in the levers folder. "We were not aware." The plea of the rich and powerful. "It's only a crime if we knew you could catch us." And then, as if on cue, a new email pinged in my personal inbox. My laptop chimed. This one wasn't from an unknown number. It wasn't a panicked voicemail. The sender was Nadia King. The subject line stopped my heart. "Subject licensing inquiry. Adaptive Compliance Engine Patent N.E. Chapman." There was no mention of Velastra, no mention of Orion Federal Trust, no repaused pitch. It was a new thread, a clean slate. My name, my patent. I opened it. The email was as precise and sharp as she was. "Natalie, thank you for your time as an observer today. Your presence was clarifying. My team and our legal counsel were exceptionally impressed with the architecture detailed in your patent. It is the most robust and elegant solution to the regulatory challenges we face. To that end, Orion Federal Trust would like to formally open a discussion about licensing the Adaptive Compliance Engine directly with you as the patent holder. We would, of course, prefer to have the original inventor oversee the implementation to ensure its integrity. We are open to discussing your terms. We are prepared to move quickly. As for Velastra, we are reevaluating our entire relationship with them. We are open to considering them as an implementation contractor under your direction, assuming they remain involved at all." I read that last line 3 times. Assuming they remain involved at all. She hadn't just paused the pitch. She had fired them, and she had just offered me their job, their contract, and their future. I took a screenshot. I saved the email as a PDF. I forwarded the original to Lena. I only added 1 line of text. They just cut out the middleman, or more accurately, the middle boy. As I hit send, my phone buzzed again, a signal message from Jordan. "It's a full-on meltdown. Nat, they're making everyone who ever spoke to you sign a new IP awareness addendum. HR is holding an urgent all-hands in 10 minutes about respectful communication around ongoing legal matters. They're trying to plug 100 holes in a dam that already broke." I looked at Jordan's message. I looked at Nadia's email. A panicked, dying company, trying to patch its own fraud with more HR paperwork, and a multi-billion-dollar bank, ignoring them completely and talking to me. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This wasn't about getting justice as an employee. My time as an employee was over. A role I had been fired from. I was something else now. I closed my email. I closed my Signal. I closed all the folders full of evidence. I opened a new blank document, a clean slate. I typed a title at the top. It wasn't a resume. It wasn't a grievance letter. It was a proposal. Chapman Integrity Labs, Draft Terms of Service. For the first time since I'd walked into that glass conference room, I wasn't an architect on the defense. I was a solutions provider, and I was about to name my price. The invitation arrived by email, jointly from Neil Carlton's board-level address and Nadia King's compliance chief address. It was not a request. It was a summons. Urgent governance review regarding the Orion Federal Trust engagement. It was scheduled for the next morning. This wasn't a pitch. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an informal, high-stakes, corporate tribunal held over Zoom. Lena and I didn't take the call from my apartment. We sat in her small, sterile conference room, a single piece of abstract art on the wall behind us. We wore matching dark blazers. We were a single, united, professional front, Chapman Integrity Labs, Population 2, the Zoom call populated, a grid of strained, powerful faces. Gregory Hale, the CEO, was in a featureless room, not his grand mahogany office. He looked smaller, his expensive tan replaced by a sickly gray pallor. Mason was in a box next to him, staring at the camera with dead, haunted eyes, like a man who hadn't slept. Then there was the bored Neil Carlton, who had left the panicked voicemail, and three others, including one older, severe-looking man I recognized as Elliot Crane, their longest-serving director, and on the other side, Nadia King and Mark Sutter from Orion, their video quality sharp, their expressions clear and unforgiving. Gregory Hale started, his voice attempting its usual buttery, CEO-level charm. It came out strained, like a scratched record. Thank you, everyone, for joining on such short notice. We believe there has been a profound misunderstanding regarding the IP attribution on the Orion project. Natalie, he said, forcing a smile at my camera, contributed some wonderful early ideation, of course. But the framework itself was developed collectively by our team under Mason's leadership. Mr. Hale, Mark Sutter cut in. His voice was not charming, it was cold steel. I'm going to stop you right there. A new window popped up. Mark was sharing his screen. We're not here to discuss ideation, he said, as his cursor highlighted the text. On his screen, for all to see, was the cover page of my patent. This is a complete, granted, utility patent, number 10, dash. He read the full number. Filed 18 months ago, granted 9 weeks ago, inventor Natalie E. Chapman. It protects, in full, the entire logic structure you presented as your proprietary model. This is not ideation. This is ownership. The screen went back to the grid of faces. Gregory looked like he'd been slapped. Mason, seeing his father falter, suddenly lurched forward, his voice cracking. But I led the implementation. I led the team. That should count for ownership under our employment terms. She was an employee. Lena unmuted herself. Her voice was serene, almost academic. Mr. Hale, she said, addressing Mason directly, who flinched. Implementation does not override inventorship. We have, of course, reviewed Ms. Chapman's employment agreement. She was not hired as an officer of the company. The assignment clause for pre-existing intellectual property does not apply. This patent was filed, on her own time, from her own home, before the Orion project was even scoped. Velastra has no legal claim to it whatsoever. There was a heavy silence. Then, a new voice. Elliot Crane, the old board member, unmuted. His voice was a dry, papery rustle. Gregory, he said, not looking at Mason, but directly at his CEO. I have to be on the record here. I recall asking you about this very risk over 6 months ago. I asked you if we were protected, building our entire next-generation compliance offering around a single architect's personal methodology. Gregory Hale's face went from gray to white. Elliot, I told you. Yes, Elliot said, cutting him off. You did. You told me. And I quote, Natalie is loyal. She won't make it a thing. You made an assumption of loyalty, Gregory. In place of a legal contract, you assumed it was a public execution. A board member, sensing blood in the water, was detaching himself from the CEO, throwing him to the sharks to save the ship. Nadia King's voice sliced through the infighting. This is all very informative, she said. It certainly explains the misalignment, but I have a simpler, more direct question for both Mr. Hale Sr. and Mr. Hale Jr. She paused, letting the entire call hang on her words. Given what we've seen, and given what Mr. Crane just confirmed that you knew this was her personal IP, How do you explain your decision to terminate the sole named inventor 7 weeks after her patent was granted, and then proceed to pitch her proprietary model, using her diagrams, as if your CEO's son's team owned it? The kill shot. The question that had no good answer. Gregory Hale began to bluster. It was a catastrophic communication breakdown. HR. The performance reviews were, there was a misalignment of. Mason, desperate, finally shouted, "We were going to offer equity later. After the deal closed, we were going to cut her in. She was being paranoid. Paranoid. He'd said the word. Paranoid." Lena's voice was soft, dangerous. "Thank you for clarifying that. Mason." Lena shared her screen. It was the Slack exchange. My warning. His reply. "You worry too much. That's why you're stuck in the back end." And this, an email to Tory Blake, where you refer to my client's legal concerns as paranoid and obstructive. Lena stopped sharing. This does not look like a communication breakdown. It looks like a textbook case of willful infringement and illegal retaliation. The grid was silent. The board members looked ill. Finally, a third board member, one I didn't know, unmuted. His virtual background was a blurry logo for a private equity firm. He looked like a man who only cared about numbers. "What?" he asked, his voice flat. "Is our exposure here ballpark? If Orion walks, and Ms. Chapman sues for damages and willful infringement, how bad is it?" The question wasn't about right or wrong. It was about damage. It was the only question they truly understood. Gregory Hale had no answer. Mason looked like he was going to throw up. Mark Sutter, the Orion lawyer, finally unmuted. He was the voice of the customer, the voice of the money, and he was about to pronounce judgment. "For us, this is simple," he said, as if addressing a child. "Orion Federal Trust cannot, and will not, be party to IP fraud. Our regulators would crucify us. We will only proceed if our partners see a clean, verifiable chain of IP ownership." He paused, and I saw his eyes in his little video box flick to my square. "Right now, the only clean link in this entire chain is Ms. Chapman." Every single person in the urgent governance review turned their virtual gaze to me. The weight of the entire call, of the entire deal, had just been placed in my lap. I didn't speak. I looked at Lena. It was her turn. Lena unmuted, leaning forward just slightly. "Our position," she said, her voice filling the void, "is also simple. One, Natalie is open to licensing her patent and providing implementation oversight. She is, after all, the only person on this planet who can legally and technically do so. Her negotiations to that effect, directly with Orion Federal Trust, are already underway." I saw Gregory Hale's eyes widen. He hadn't known. "Two," Lena continued, her voice hardening just a fraction. "If Velastra wants to be a part of that future, if Orion decides to hire you as a simple, third-party implementation contractor, under my client's direct supervision, then the very first step is a public and complete acknowledgement of inventorship and a full, immediate, and satisfactory addressing of the illegal retaliation." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. She had just read them their terms of surrender. She had just told the king that he was now, at best, a foot soldier, and that he would have to beg the woman his son had banished for a job. The call was over. That Zoom call was the last time I spoke to anyone at Velastra. Lena and I sat in silence for a moment after their panicked, gray-faced video feeds blinked off. The fallout was immediate, but it didn't come to me. It went, as it should, to my lawyer. Lena's phone buzzed about 20 minutes later. She glanced at it, a small, satisfied smile playing on her lips. "Neil Carlton," she said. She put him on speakerphone. His voice was no longer shaky. It was the grim, resolved tone of a man cleaning house. He informed Lena that the board had just concluded its private session. They had voted unanimously to hire an external, independent investigations firm. The goal was not a review. It was an audit. The specific mandate to determine the full scope of Gregory and Mason Hale's gross misrepresentation of core IP ownership to both the board and a key client. They weren't just being fired, they were being investigated by their own people to build the case against them. The rats were not just fleeing the ship. They were setting fire to the captain's quarters on the way out. While Velastra was busy consuming itself, my inbox chimed. Orion Federal Trust does not waste time. The subject line was Term Sheet Exclusive Licensing Agreement. Natalie E. Chapman, Orion Federal Trust. It was a thing of beauty, a 20-page document that laid out, in excruciating legal detail, exactly how the new world would work. I, Natalie E. Chapman, as the sole licensor, would grant Orion an exclusive 5-year license to the Adaptive Multi-Layer Compliance Engine, which they had already agreed to call the Chapman Engine in all internal documentation. Velastra Data Forge was mentioned, exactly once, in a subsection on implementation. They were listed as one of 3 pre-screened implementation contractors who could be hired, at Orion's discretion and my approval, to assist in the data migration. They would have no access to the core logic. They would have no ownership rights. They would be, if I allowed it, a temporary contractor on the project I had built, a project now run by the woman they had fired. I signed the contract 2 days later. Not in a glass-walled tower, not in a lawyer's mahogany-paneled office. I signed it in a small, quiet, rented co-working space in a different neighborhood, a place that smelled like fresh coffee and new carpet. I sat at a simple white desk, a small, stubborn-looking cactus next to my laptop. There was no corporate logo behind me, no billion-dollar skyline view. There was just my name, Natalie E. Chapman, on the licensor line, and my signature next to it. The IP was mine. The control was mine. The future was mine. Velastra tried one last, pathetic time. They didn't understand. They sent a reconciliation offer to Lena. It was almost laughable. A formal, internal-only apology for the misunderstanding, a one-time consulting fee of $50,000 to compensate for my transition, and as a sign of their commitment to change, Mason Hale would be reassigned to lead new initiatives in their Singapore office. Lena read the email, took a sip of her coffee, and just laughed. She called me. They still think this is about your feelings. Nat, they still think this is about a bonus and an apology. They don't get it. It's about structure. It's about ownership. We, of course, politely and firmly declined. The real news broke a few days later, in a way that was beautifully, brutally corporate. A low-level employee, probably Jordan, forwarded me the company-wide email. Subject Leadership Transition. Dear Velastra Team, it began. Effective immediately. Gregory Hale is resigning from his role as CEO to pursue personal interests and spend more time with his family. We thank him for his years of service. The classic, the spend more time with his family. The corporate executioner's final, polite phrase. The next paragraph was even better. Mason Hale will also be leaving Velastra to pursue new opportunities. We wish him the best in his future endeavors. Not reassigned to Singapore, not taking on a new role. Just gone, a non-person, deleted from the very system that he thought he owned. They were both out, not with a bang, but with a bland, humiliating HR email. On the very same day, as if timed for maximum impact, Orion Federal Trust issued a press release to the financial markets. I read it on my phone. Orion Federal Trust partners with Chapman Integrity Labs to deploy next-generation compliance solution. Chapman Integrity Labs, my new consulting firm, which Lena had helped me officially form 2 days prior. The release went on. This new system, based on the proprietary Chapman engine, will be deployed over the next 6 months under the direct supervision of the system's inventor, Ms. Natalie E. Chapman. Velastra was mentioned once, in a single sentence at the bottom. As the former vendor on the project, Jordan sent me one last thing from the inside, a final souvenir from the wreckage. It was a screenshot of Mason's last ever Slack message. Sent in a private channel just moments before his account was deactivated. Watch her turn this into some victim story for internet clout. I read it. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel hurt. I felt nothing. I saved the screenshot. I dragged it into my levers folder, into a new subfolder I named Receipts. I didn't need to make this a victim story. He had done that all by himself, and I didn't need internet clout. I had the patent. I had the contract. I had the byline. This morning, I logged into my new project dashboard with Orion. I looked at the timeline, the budgets, the team I was being paid to hire, and this time, no one could take my name off the slides. I opened the file repository. I created the first governance rule. Any module, document, or code snippet utilizing the core logic must include the tag Chapman Engine. I'm telling you this story, the person on the other side of this screen, not so you can get a cheap thrill from watching a nepotism baby fail. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand something. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can have in this world, the most dangerous weapon, is not the loudest voice in the meeting. It's not a fight in an HR office. It's your name, in the right font, in the right place, on a legal, government-issued document that no CEO's son can erase. I closed my laptop, the screen going dark. I stood up from my desk in that quiet, rented room. I grabbed my blazer and walked out into the afternoon sun, leaving the glass and steel towers of the downtown skyline behind me. They were wrong. You see, they thought they had fired me in that glass conference room. They thought they had disposed of me. But you can't fire the person who owns the architecture. You can only, temporarily, escort them from the building. And then wait, hat in hand, at their new front door, begging them to let you rent back the very thing you thought you stole. Thank you for listening to my story. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from. I'd love to connect and hear your thoughts. If you love this, make sure to subscribe to Boss Revenge Stories, smash that like button, and support us by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.